Well, to make matters even more ludicrous, they then arrested some homeless man and charged him with arson, terrorism, the whole lot. Now, this homeless man somehow breached the security of Parliament, which is significant, but he didn't just get into the perimeter and start a fire from the outside. He got in, but he didn't start on the ground floor. He went up to the top floor. I mean, if you believe this scenario, which is, no conspiracy here, just one homeless man, absolutely. It's sort of like, Lee Harvey Oswald, lone gunner, shooting from 3 different directions sort of thing, no conspiracy, go back to sleep.
Hello, my name is Donald, and welcome to the #1 media company, WorldView. At WorldView, we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. Today, we're chatting again with Dr. Peter Hammond. He is the founder of organizations like the Frontline Fellowship, the Reformation Society, and many other Christian organizations. The doctor is the author of many books, which we will display on the screen and provide links at the bottom for more information. Doctor, welcome back to the show. So we just heard, or recently, the South African Parliament suffered some extensive damage due to a fire. And it seems like you have some inside information as to why that fire broke out. Can you tell our viewers, why was the South African Parliament set on fire?
There's so many strange things about this. It was said by Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Benjamin Disraeli that nothing in politics happens by accident. If it happens in politics, you can be sure it was planned that way. Interesting quote. Well, on the 2nd of January, in the early hours of the morning, a fire broke out in Parliament. In fact, it probably started around midnight because the fire had been raging probably for about 5 hours before it was spotted. Now, there's a whole lot of very strange things. And because I actually worked in the fire brigade before when I was studying at theological college, firefighting was my job that put me through college. I did the midnight shift. I was a midnight shift, 8 hours a night, 6 days a week. So in fighting, there's a whole lot of things you just have to. And one of the things is, of course, inspections and seeing that the fire doors are shut and that the smoke detectors work. So, well, would you believe one of the most expensive buildings in the country, if not the most expensive building in the country, none of the fire alarms worked. None of the smoke detectors worked. None of the sprinklers worked. In fact, the sprinklers had been turned off. And extraordinary, there wasn't one single security person within the entire building complex on duty at that time. They'd been given the weekend off. There were some guards at the gate, but there was not one security personnel in the building. So the Parliament was on fire for many hours, 5-6 hours or so, before some hikers on top of Table Mountain in the early hours of the Sunday morning, the 2nd of January, noticed smoke billowing out of the roof of the Parliament buildings, and phoned by cell phone the Cape Town City Fire Department, who responded very quickly. Roland Street is actually in the same street as Parliament, and they were at the gate before. There were no fire alarms. There was no call from Parliament. The fire brigades at the gates trying to convince the police to let them in. To put out the fire in a building. I mean, it sounds so ridiculous. It doesn't sound possible. Well, it gets worse. I mean, the fire was raging for hours. Now, this is the oldest parliament in the Southern Hemisphere. Dates back to the 1850s. And this particular parliament building was completed in the 1980s. And it's packed full of historic, you can just imagine, original, irreplaceable oil on canvases and documents and research and libraries. There's just so much involved in Parliament. And the main assembly chamber was gutted. Interestingly, the fire started on the 3rd floor, the top floor actually, which by American estimation would be the 4th floor, because we have ground floor, then 1st floor and so on, as opposed to Americans have 1st floor, 2nd, so on. So it's the 3rd floor, the 4th floor, depending on whether you're American or not. It was started in the ANC members of Parliament's offices, which just happened to have a whole lot of people's laptops, which were needed for evidence for an investigation to state capture corruption. There's a huge, massive, colossal investigation called the Zondo Commission right now on the go, looking into state capture corruption. And a whole lot of the evidence just got burned up over that weekend from the fire that started in the offices. And it seemed that they all left their computers at the office over the weekend, the long weekend, and there were no police. And a lot of coincidences came together. You know, the dog ate my homework, that sort of thing. Well, it gets even more bizarre because after the fire was put out, the fire chief walked around and noticed that almost all the fire doors were latched open. Now, fire doors are meant to be shut for the very purpose of stopping a fire spreading. So, for example, in any fire, if all the doors are open, no matter how small or large the building, in 20 minutes, the whole establishment, warehouse, hospital, hotel is destroyed if all doors are open. Hence, you have fire doors. A fire door can slow down a fire for anything from 20 minutes for a pathetic door to a couple of hours if it's a really good solid door. So that's why if you go to hotels, hospitals, and so on, you've got doors that are meant to be shut all the time. And they've got springs on to make sure that they're shut. You might sometimes see them propped open because people find inconvenient opening these doors over and over. But the fire doors are there for a very, very good reason. Well, these fire doors were all latched open with metal latches. I mean, this wasn't just propped up temporarily. Metal latches which kept the fire doors open, which means a fire gets spread because a fire is a triangle: fuel, heat, and oxygen. A fire needs oxygen to breathe. Without the oxygen, the fire dies, or at least it slumbers. And when a person opens the door, you suddenly get a whole lot more oxygen, and you can get a massive resurgence or even explosion, backdraft of the fire. So the fact that there were all these fire doors that would have slowed down or stopped a fire for a very significant amount of time were propped open defeats the whole aim of the object, because extra oxygen was able to come in, and the fires were not only able to breathe, but to spread quickly into the next rooms and galleries and even assembly chambers and gutted. So incredibly, even after the fire brigade had extinguished the blaze, it went through the whole of Sunday. They started off with 30 firefighters and 5 fire engines. It ended up with something like 300 firefighters, 75 vehicles there. It was a big fire. This was really serious. And a massive, we're talking about billions of rands worth of damage. And after the fire brigade had left, fires out, left, all back in the station, the fire re-erupted on late Monday afternoon and blazed through the evening. So this fire was being fought into the Tuesday, which is just, it makes you just wonder, how on earth can that happen? Well, to make matters even more ludicrous, they then arrested some homeless man and charged him with arson, terrorism, the whole. Now, this homeless man somehow breached the security of Parliament, which is significant, but he didn't just get into the perimeter and start a fire from the outside. He got in, but he didn't start on the ground floor. He went up to the top floor. I mean, if you believe this scenario, which is, no conspiracy here, just one homeless man, absolutely. It's sort of like, Lee Harvey Oswald, lone gunner, shooting from 3 different directions sort of thing, no conspiracy, go back to sleep. So here's the more extraordinary things. Parliament in South Africa has been locked down for almost 2 years. So 22 months Parliament has been in recess, not able to meet because of the COVID cult, lockdown lunacy, masquerade madness, salvation by vaccination. The whole COVID cult had locked down Parliament. So we were being run by a committee of 6, an emergency committee under disaster management regulations, something like state of disaster, state of emergency, mixed with martial law, whatever they were trying to do. A committee of 6 were running it without regard to Parliament. And so after 22 months of lockdown, that week, Parliament was going to meet for the first time since the pandemic, scamdemic lockdown. And would you know it, a fire starts and guts the venue. And that the first item on the agenda of Parliament was to evaluate the Zondo Commission, first report of the state capture, the corruption. And the next stated item of business was the opposition party had scheduled that they planned to issue a vote of no confidence in the president. And would you know it, there's a fire, New Year's Day, actually New Year's Day Eve. And at the same time, what a coincidence that a homeless man decides to do this, that it just happens to be the one weekend that there's no security in Parliament. The whole Parliamentary Protection Service been given a weekend off because they didn't want to pay overtime, apparently, most expensive building in the country. And can you imagine that nothing worked? Not a smoke detector, not a fire alarm, not the sprinkler systems, and all the fire doors were propped open. So, make of it what you will. I would like to see the results of investigation here, but the initial fire department report was incredibly damning of every breach of security. Do you know that the sprinkler system had not been serviced since 2017? In Parliament, the sprinklers, and somebody had switched off, which is not an easy thing to do. I mean, it's a complex, and this is a huge building too. So there's many of these, but they were all switched off. So that's some of the backstory to the fire in Parliament, the oldest Parliament in the Southern Hemisphere.
Doctor, didn't you also mention that there was going to be a discussion in Parliament in regards to a payment that the South African government received to lock down their country?
This was also going to be challenged because reportedly we received $500 billion, billion with a B, for COVID relief with the lockdown. Now, this apparently came from the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, as a condition of hard lockdown and so on and so forth. The whole Chinese model of lockdown, which of course has no basis, or didn't have a basis for until 2 years ago in the Western world. This was the communist Chinese model of totally locking down the country, forcing mandatory masks and all that sort of thing. So we also know that Tanzania and Belarus presidents reported that they had been offered a $500 billion bribe to lock their countries down. And in both cases, they refused and said, our country's economy is worth more than that, and so, but this money's at your discretion. And so this explains why so many countries around the world had a uniform response, because they were being bribed to do so. And it was, here's the carrot, we will give you all this money if you do X, Y, and Z. And some countries refused and pointed out an interesting same amount, 500 billion. And so our president accepted it, only it never got to the businesses that were being locked down, and the businesses that were destroyed, the people who were out of work and so on as a result of legislation. It all disappeared. 500 billion just lost. So that was one of the things to investigate as to whatever happened to the Solidarity Fund, the COVID Relief Fund, the money made available by the World Bank. Nobody we know ever got it, and people from one side of the country are complaining that they got no compensation from the government for economic suicide.
And I don't know if it's the minister or a former prime minister of Tanzania. Didn't he also die after he made this statement in regards to the funds that were made available to Tanzania?
He did. He's a youngish man. He is in his 50s, and he is healthy as far as we know. And he was very derogatory of the whole lockdown lunacy and the COVID scam. He is a medical doctor. And so the president of Tanzania actually took in for samples everything from a papaya, which is a fruit, through to saliva of a goat, and everything came back, positive for COVID. Just ridiculing the whole PCR test, which was never designed for this anyway, and which even the inventor of it said, it was never designed to deal with COVID-19. 97% of the positives were false positives. So it was totally inefficient. But Tanzanian president, being a medical doctor, was not impressed with the whole WHO story from the beginning, and he laughed it off, and he just refused to play the game. And next thing, he dies unexpectedly. A lot of my Tanzanian friends are convinced that he was murdered, and he is replaced by the vice president, who just happens to be a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Vaccination supports the whole COVID cult, the whole deal. So the Tanzanians are extremely suspicious and believe that their president was assassinated because of opposing the WHO narrative.
But how is it possible to just assassinate a president without widespread coverage?
Indeed, where's the investigation? Where's the response about it. It seems to have just been suppressed under a deluge of COVID propaganda. And so, yes, I know a number of Tanzanians who all are convinced their president was assassinated, and there's a cover-up since.
Can one say that the fire that broke out in Parliament was just a series of, I mean, the South African government is known to be incompetent. Can it just be described as incompetence in general? Or do you think there's just too many mysterious occurrences to say that this was just incompetence?
Incompetence certainly plays a role. There's a lot of incompetence, but this goes beyond it, doesn't it? Because, any 2 or 3 of those factors that I mentioned would be horrific incompetence and criminal negligence. But it breaks so many of the fire regulations, and in fact it was tabled in Parliament, and there was a whole lot of complaints before, and the fire chiefs gave the Parliament a fail regularly, and for years have been warning them about their failure to adhere to this and the other. So there's that side too. But when you add it to things that incompetence, it is criminal incompetence to have a fire system, sprinkler system that hasn't been serviced since 2017. It's incredibly, our mission wouldn't dream of going a year without having our whole, we have all our fire extinguishers serviced. We double check everything to do with it. We have fire drills at least once a year. That's a little mission. Nothing compared to the quality of Parliament. So all of that's criminal negligence. But to go beyond that, how is it possible that none of the sprinklers worked? None of the smoke detectors work. This is an awful lot of incompetence. It goes beyond. You would have thought at least something would work. But who put the personal protection services people all on leave over the long weekend? And how come there wasn't one on board? And by the way, they haven't had a head of the parliamentary protection services for several years, because the top 2, both the head and the vice, are on suspension with pay for some kinds of criminal activities. So they didn't even have a leader for the Parliamentary Protection Services, and then it all puts off duty for the long weekend. All of this just adds up to, if it's incompetence and coincidences, it's an awful lot. I think it strains credulity to believe that there wasn't some sinister hand behind us.
If it's not the homeless person who you believe is a patsy, a Lee Harvey Oswald, who do you think created the fire? Do you think it was a member of Parliament that just created a fire on the 3rd floor?
It's believed to be more than just an individual. In fact, there are several political parties in opposition who have already suggested that very thing, and there are different political parties, opposition groups, Action SA, Africa Transformation, ATM, and so on, who have all questioned very publicly, Freedom Front and others, that how is this all possible, and speculating whether this is in any way faction fighting within the ANC, because we've got a very strong faction fighting between the Zuma supporting ANC and the Mbeki supporting ANC and the Ramaphosa groups, and that there's a power struggle within them. And it is believed, and it is accused and counter-accused from these groups, that members within the ANC and even the security establishment, meaning intelligence and so on, who orchestrate the July riots and looting spree, which crippled vast amounts of KwaZulu-Natal and parts of Gauteng, billions of dollars worth of looting, arson, destruction, done in the space of a week, from the 9th of July on last year. And all the theories and investigations indicate that it's elements of the government. It's just as one group is accusing another one and so on. So it's definitely an ANC faction, but which ANC faction is, it differs depending who's making accusations. So within the government itself, they're accusing members of the government of being part of that riotous looting spree insurrection back in July last year, 2021. And now there's speculation that this parliamentary fire could be to stave off, to delay the investigations and also the accountability of government to Parliament, and of course all the corruption investigations of the Zondo Commission. So these are theories. we don't know. I mean, we're dependent on the investigation people to come out with it. But opposition parties have put out official releases saying that this is obviously arson, and it obviously couldn't just be a homeless person. This is an extremely hard to believe cover story, and speculation as to who within the government and which faction is behind it. But this is beyond any one person's capability. There's got to be a conspiracy of a sort.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's scary that someone would try to burn down a parliament of a country just to hide incriminating evidence. But Doctor, if we can pivot to, I know you've met Nelson Mandela, right? You were part of a protest that protested one of his, I believe it was abortion, the legalization of abortion in South Africa. And eventually you met Nelson Mandela in person. Can you tell our viewers that story?
Yes, so although I'm a missionary and my primary concern is helping persecute churches and work in restricted access areas throughout Africa, and God willing, by next month we'll make 40 years since our first cross-border mission. But we increasingly got concerned in the 90s about how South Africa was being paganized, secularized, a lot of very dangerous movements, and we perceived the missionary sending base of South Africa being threatened. So I launched a group called Africa Christian Action already in 1991 in order to make a stand for the right to life for preborn babies, against attempts to legalize abortion, so on. The reason is, in the old South Africa, abortion was illegal, pornography was illegal, blasphemy was illegal, Sabbath protection laws kept shops shut on Sundays, cinemas were shut, only church were open Sundays, and so on. That was the old South Africa. Well, in the 1990s, we saw first FW de Klerk, then Nelson Mandela, increasingly paganizing and secularizing the country. So I mobilized a number of protests, and one of the biggest ones was in 1995. We mobilized 30,000 people to march through Cape Town to Parliament to protest against the Constitutional Assembly, which was at that point meeting under the chairmanship of Cyril Ramaphosa, who's the president right now. And he actually had to come out and receive our petition. We'd marched 30,000 people to Parliament in order to protest against their plans in the Constitutional Assembly to legalize abortion, pornography, blasphemy, and perversion, prostitution, a whole range of things, Sabbath desecration. So it was called a Christian Voice. Grondwet op God se wet was a big slogan. Constitution upon God's law. Grondwet op God se wet. Constitution upon God's law. And so we were marching to Parliament, and Cyril Ramaphosa was actually pushed out the door to receive our petition, and he was extremely nervous. So this is the man who now is the president, but this is now, I'm talking about back in 1995. And Cyril Ramaphosa came out, his eyes were wide, he looked quite terrified, and he saw my friend Fano Sabisi, a Zulu, standing next to me. He said, "Brother, can I borrow your Bible?" And he quickly, without waiting for an answer, snatched this beautiful leather-bound Bible, which was a gift from my father-in-law, actually, to Fano Sabisi, and even a Rev Fano Sabisi engraved on the leather cover. And he goes up onto the podium. Oh, I wish I'd had a camera with me. He stands up, Cyril Ramaphosa, on the platform of the truck that we were using as our platform to speak to the crowd. And he lifts up this Bible of Fano Sabisi. "I am also Christian. Look, I bring my Bible with me to Parliament every day." And I mean, he'd seen at the audience eating out of his hands. He had been brought up a Christian evangelical. He knew the talk, and he managed to speak Christianese. And Cyril Ramaphosa gave the impression that he was one of us, whereas, in fact, as you can see from his legislation, his policies, and the fact that he's senior member of the Southern Communist Party on the Politburo of the Southern Communist Party. Well, anyway, we know how politicians can be. Well, after this march to Parliament, and then I followed up with another large march of over 10,000 people to Parliament when they were continuing to push for legalized abortion. And then Nelson Mandela, the president of South Africa at that time, summoned me to Groote, which is the estate that Cecil Rhodes bought up and donated to the people of the Cape for residence for future prime ministers of the Cape. And in the official president's residence, when he's in Cape Town, Nelson Mandela received me. I was summoned. So at the parliamentary protest meeting, And a person from his office came and said, the president wants to see you on Thursday. So we marched on Tuesday. I met the president on Thursday. And Nelson Mandela was very gracious. And his first words to me were, "So, Mr. Hammond, what were you doing in the years of struggle?" So I said, "I was fighting people like you, sir." And he laughed and he slapped his knee and he stood up, he reached out and he wanted to shake my hand again. He said, "I am so glad to meet an honest white person. Every white I've met so far always supported me, always opposed apartheid. I wondered how the National Party stayed in power for 40 years when nobody actually supported him." And I said, "Well, make no mistake, Mr. President, we were fighting against communism and against terrorism. We were not fighting for apartheid." And he said, "Apartheid was the greatest evil in the history of the world." I said, "I cannot agree with that, Mr. President. That prize must go to your friends, your supporters, the communists. They've littered the 20th century with over 160 million corpses, not foreigners killed in war, but citizens killed by their own governments in peace in many cases. 160 million people killed since 1917. Now, at that stage, we're only in 1996, by the way. And I said, the Black Book of Communism documents over 100 million Christians just killed in Eastern Europe and Russia by the Communist Party, according to their own documents alone, which includes," and I started rattling off the details. He's still quiet, so I moved on to Mao Zedong and killing 68 million people in China. And he's still silent, so I carried on to Mengistu and the Red Terror in Ethiopia, killing millions. Samora Machel in Mozambique and his Holocaust against Christians. I've done, my first mission field was the killing fields in Mozambique. And then I ended off with Fidel Castro of Cuba, who he had just welcomed to South Africa, given him the biggest award South Africans can give, and allowed him to speak to joint sittings of our upper and lower house, which has been done for virtually nobody else. Well, Nelson Mandela sat there very impassively through my catalogue of communist crimes. And he leaned back and he gazed into space and looked at the ceiling, and he drifted off to memory lane and said, "When I was a prisoner of the Boers on Robben Island, they would not allow me to wear sunglasses, and I have very sensitive eyes." I said, "Mr. President, my eyes are also very sensitive, and I can fully appreciate how painful and uncomfortable that must be. But I'm sure you will agree that hardly compares with the atrocities documented in the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn." He then questioned the Christianity of people who had justified and legalized apartheid in South Africa. And I said, "Mr. President, you're questioning the Christianity of people who justified apartheid 40 years ago. I tell you, sir, it will not be 40 years from now. People will be questioning your humanity for legalizing abortion. You're replacing apartheid with abortion. You're replacing discrimination on the basis of race with discrimination on the basis of age. And this is not just putting these babies in a different voters' roll or giving them separate residential areas or giving them separate swimming facilities. This is taking away their right to life. This is killing them before they've taken the first breath." I said, "People will judge you harshly, Mr. President, unless you bring about legislation that will protect the most innocent, the most helpless citizens of all from the violence and the injustice of abortion." Well, Mr. Mandela bounced back and forth. We did our different challenges on a whole range of historical subjects. It was an hour-long meeting. And as the clock struck the hour, he stood up and said, "You may take your photographs now." Well, honestly, I had not thought about photographs, and I didn't mean to be rude at all, but it honestly hadn't crossed my mind. I just said, "No, thank you." And he turned and his mouth dropped and he looked at me with absolute shock. We might have been the first people who met him who didn't want their pictures taken with him. I said, "But we would like to pray with you, Mr. President." And he said, no, that's very personal. I'd rather not. And he's uncomfortable. I just acted like I hadn't heard, and I put one hand on his shoulder, and Reverend Sunzivenster, who was with me, put his hand on the other shoulder, and we prayed. "Lord God, do not give Mr. Mandela one moment's peace until he does what he knows is right, enacts legislation for the protection of the most innocent and helpless citizens of all, preborn babies from the violence and injustice of abortion. Lord God, may you lead Mr. Mandela to bow his knees to you, that he may experience peace and freedom through Christ alone, through his blood atonement." And so we prayed along this line for his salvation and for him to do the right thing. And I could see he was steaming inside, but he maintained his outward composure. He's gracious. My door is always open to you, Mr. Hammond. I'm always responsive to the concerns of your constituency. I never thought I represented a constituency, but anyway, he was gracious. Okay, so that was Thursday. So we marched on Tuesday. Thursday, I was summoned to the president's mansion. Monday morning, senior investigators of the Inland Revenue Service knock on our door and begin a 7-year audit. They went back 7 years and they went forward 6 years. So we had 13 years of our financials, personal, ministry, mission, every ministry I'm involved in, got serious audits. And these were detailed, so detailed. We had to get sworn affidavits from the police for every single donation, gifts from grandparents, gifts for medical treatments for my son who was born at that time with kidney failure. Petty things. And in fact, after they'd been with us for 7 years, going through all the books and gone over 13 years worth of our financial records, in the end, we owed them nothing, not a cent. We were up to our accounting, by God's grace, was that organized. So what I learned is that Mr. Mandela could be very gracious to our face, but he set his dogs on us. I think that's something we might have learned from the Clintons. I think a lot of people who caused grief to Governor Clinton or President Clinton end up with IRS investigations and audits. So this seems to be a favorite means of some politicians to get people who upset them.
Why do you think he brought up his eye sensitivity when you mentioned all these mass murders committed by communists? Like, how could he possibly compare the two?
It's an interesting thing because there's pictures. If you go now to Robben Island, and there's even at the waterfront a gateway to Robben Island where they've got a huge, massive, it looks like some kind of airport terminal thing where you can go to get the ferry to go to Robben Island and burn incense in his cell and candles. It's a massive, I mean, floor to ceiling, massive picture of Nelson Mandela wearing sunglasses, resting on his shovel where he had a vegetable garden on Robben Island, which allowed him to do. In fact, so maybe there was at the beginning they didn't allow him to have sunglasses, but they did let him somewhere along the line because there's pictures of him wearing sunglasses. And this is, I didn't put them up there. Those are pictures that the ANC put up to honor Mandela. So, Robben Island was not exactly the way it's depicted in a whole lot of movies as some kind of devil's island like the French ran in South America. Robben Island was actually a bit of a paradise island. And I've been there. I went there when it was still an operational prison. And the prisoners were allowed out of their cells, wandering across the island during the day. They could have their sports. They could be having their vegetable gardens, things like this. And it's a beautiful island. The whole of Cape Town could be under clouds and rain, and Robben Island would be in the sun. Beautiful. I mean, thousands of penguins, vast amounts of other wildlife. It's a beautiful little island. And they had to be in their cells. They were locked up at night. But I've been in prisons around Africa, and let me tell you, if I had to choose, Robben Island would be to me far and away the nicest prison I could think of anywhere in the world. I don't know what the Scandinavian ones are, but all the prisons I know, Robben Island was the least worst. So I went on an official tour there later where there were people who used to be inmates at Robben Island. And so they were all ANC people, and it was now an ANC cult-like veneration going around and, light a candle in the cell and things like this. And they were talking about how terrible it was. And so one of our people said, so how would that compare with, for example, Pollsmoor Prison today, speaking about the prisons we have? He said, oh, no, well, compared to the prisons we've got in South Africa today, it was like a 5-star hotel. And I mean, that's one of the ANC inmates, one of the people who'd been locked up there for terrorism. So, I don't want to make light of a person being confined in a prison. It's no joke and it's not pleasant. But having said that, he did have access to a library. He did have a desk. He did have all sorts of things that we never had when I was in Lusaka Central Prison. We didn't have desks, tables, beds. We didn't have sheets, pillows. We didn't have cooked meals. We didn't have plates and knives and forks. And the whole situation was one big disease factory squatter camp. there were 50 to 60 prisoners in a cell, 25 feet by 15 feet, and you cramming these people without any beds, without any facilities. Forget about bunks. I mean, there was no bedding, there was no plumbing, there's no electricity, there was no flowing water. Every bit of water in the Lusaka Central Prison for 1,200 prisoners had to be carried in buckets. Every bit of filth had to be carried out in buckets. I mean, can you imagine the whole condition? It was one big disease factory, and people who died in our cells were carried out in the morning because the conditions were just so stifling and shocking. So I'm just giving an example of an African prison, and yet they make out like Robben Island was the worst prison in Africa, which it wasn't, and that Nelson Mandela was so badly treated. Which, do you know that Newsweek interviewed him after he became president and wanted to know about what tortures he suffered in Robben Island? And he said, well, he wasn't tortured. They said, when you're in a police custody, because he was on Robben Island for, I think, 22 years. No, 18 years of the 25 years that he was incarcerated system. But most people think of, in fact, I've heard people saying, 30 years locked up in the cell. Well, 18 years in Robben Island, and most of the time was out of the cell. And the last several years he was actually at Fairstead, or we often called five-star prison, where he had a warden's house with swimming pool and had, all sorts of facilities and beautiful cooked meals. And so he was not a normal prisoner, and he wasn't treated the worst either. And when I was locked up in the Lusaka Central Prison, I had Zambians, this is under Kunda, I had Zambians saying to me, South Africa's got to be a great country. I said, why do you say that? He said, you had Nelson Mandela locked up there for 22 years. He said, nobody can survive in prison in Africa for longer than 8 years. Most die within 3 or 4 years. You must have a wonderful country if a person can survive in prison for 22 years. Well, that's just some of the comments that you could get in Zambia, just showing them the different attitude. But Mandela was asked, were you tortured? He said, no. He said, at no time. Were you mistreated by any of the guards? And Mandela started to get a bit irritated with Newsweek. And he said, it's bad enough to be locked up. No, I wasn't tortured, and it's true, he was locked up, but he wasn't tortured. I think that's quite a statement on the old South Africa, that he could have been at the mercy of prison wardens, police, and so on for 26 years without any acts of abuse. Because if there were any, he would have milked it, I'm sure, and the media would have. And I think it's intriguing that Amnesty International did not take Nelson Mandela's case ever, because it said he's not a political prisoner. And most people call him a political prisoner, but he wasn't a political prisoner. He was in prison not for writing a poem or writing a letter like Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He was in prison for being the head of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the terrorist arm of the ANC, for organizing and orchestrating hundreds of bombings and terrorist campaigns, which included people, grandmothers and grandchildren, getting incinerated in petrol bombs, and the Johannesburg railway station bombing, and a whole lot of things like this were done by Umkhonto we Sizwe while he was in charge of Umkhonto we Sizwe. And he pleaded guilty, by the way, to 156 charges of public violence, terrorism, and so on, at his trial in Rivonia. So, in fact, when Nelson Mandela was sentenced, I might add, a very liberal judge, the Star, which is about as liberal a newspaper as it comes in South Africa, about as left-wing and anti-South African old government newspaper was, said that praised the judge for this extremely enlightened, lenient sentence, because as the editor noted, that what he was charged with was essentially treason, which carried the death penalty. And to be honest, at that time, 1964, he would have been electrocuted in America, guillotined in France, hung in Britain for the same crimes. Anyone else, who had committed those kind of crimes in those countries. So for the South African judicial system to have given such a lenient sentence as life imprisonment to someone who had committed vast amounts of violence, which included murders, who'd been trained overseas by even the Cuban security police, including, he met with Che Guevara. This is a high-profile communist international terrorist leader, and that he was treated so well, I think, is a tribute to the old South African prison wardens and police, because I've been in the hands of people when arrested. I'm thinking now Zimbabwe, Zambia, Mozambique, Sudan, and abuse is part of the deal. It's extremely surprising when you hear of a person who's been arrested in Africa who has not been abused. So Nelson Mandela making a big thing about sunglasses, I was surprised, because if that's the worst he could come out with about the Boers, it does not match up to what the communists have done in the past, or what Nelson Mandela's government did, in fact, even while he was president.
Interesting. Do you believe he was a Freemason?
Oh, there's no question about it. It's not a theory. Nelson Mandela was certainly a Freemason. He was a very high degree Freemason. He was, I think, a 32 or 33rd degree Freemason. There's pictures of him in his full Freemason regalia. In fact, I've got the Freemasonry magazine. I've got a picture of it where he's on the cover of the Freemasonry magazine of South Africa, as, one of the most honored members. Interesting enough, Desmond Tutu and Thabo Mbeki were also Freemasons. And when Desmond Tutu had his funeral earlier this year, do you know that he was not just dressed in his Archbishop's regalia, but he had Freemason regalia as well. And there was Freemason elements to the funeral because he was a well-known Freemason. So this isn't a theory. That's an established fact. Also, by the way, when Nelson Mandela died, his family, the ANC, Southern Communist Party, all admitted he always was a senior member of the Southern Communist Party Politburo. Even though during his lifetime, for tactical reasons, they say, he denied that he was a communist and denied that he's a member of the Communist Party, he always was a senior member of the Southern Communist Party. So he perjured himself and lied throughout his life that he wasn't a communist, but he was. But it was known that he couldn't have gotten the support he did and the public adulation if it had been known. You may recall, if you go back in history, that New York Times and others steadfastly denied that Fidel Castro was a communist. He was just popular leader of the revolution and so on and so forth. And then once Fidel Castro became president, total communism, Communist Party of Cuba, banned everyone else, executed thousands of people and so on and so forth, turned that island paradise into a hellhole, and millions of Cubans fled. So interesting how it's acceptable to lie for convenience, because, as Vladimir Lenin said, treaties are like pie crusts made to be broken. To tell the truth is a petty bourgeois habit, but to lie, and to lie convincingly, is a sign of superior intelligence. So the end justifies the means.
Where do you think Nelson Mandela became a Freemason? Before or after prison, or during prison?
I'm convinced he was a Freemason long before prison. The evidence is there. He went into the legal profession. He was already very high placed before he went to prison. In fact, it was his being high placed that probably got him the position of being head of Umkhonto we Sizwe and so on. So these people choose their proteges early on. So that, for example, if we look at Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, he was early on selected for special treatment and to be a Freemason. And you get this from his own authorized biography, Rebel Rouser for Peace. So that's the authorized biography of Desmond Tutu. How, as a young priest already, before he even became priest, the richest man in South Africa, Harry Oppenheimer, who was head of Anglo-American De Beers, Diamonds, the big, mega big billionaire company. And he paid for all the studies, all the debts. There was a whole lot of debts of Tutu that prevented him from becoming a priest. Harry Oppenheimer, who hasn't been known as a philanthropist, but anyway, he settles the bills of this unknown man to enable him to become a priest, and buys him a house, a very nice house in Orlando West, a very upmarket place, and ensured that all his studies, and then enabled Desmond Tutu, before he became anything of significance, to meet with Kurt Waldheim, Secretary General of the United Nations, to meet with the Archbishop of Canterbury, to meet with the Pope, and so on and so forth. So these people, whether you're talking about Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela, they were selected very early on, both as Freemasons and for support, and fast-tracked to fame.
There's a lot of reports that fewer and fewer people are part of Freemasonry. Do you think Freemasonry still has a powerful influence in today's world?
It would seem so, because the Freemasons, certainly in South Africa. So here's an intriguing anecdote about our parliament. When I met with Nelson Mandela in 1996, when he's president, one of the topics of conversation just happened to get onto the fact that they wanted to relocate Parliament. And they want to relocate Parliament up to Transvaal. They'd never liked the idea of the three capitals. So South Africa, coming from reformed roots, has separated executive, judicial, and legislative forms of government geographically, even, so that the executive capital of South Africa is Pretoria, where union buildings and the president's offices. The legislative capital of South Africa is Cape Town, 1,400 kilometers away, where we have Parliament. And the judicial capital is Bloemfontein, where we have our Supreme Court. So South Africa's got this decentralization built in, which the communists hate. They've continually, we want one capital. That's been a demand of the EFF and the ANC. They want to bring about one capital. So Mandela was trying to relocate Parliament to Midrand, which is just halfway between Johannesburg and Pretoria. And there was this big move, we're going to move Parliament. So one of the people in this meeting with Mr. Mandela was the, I should call him the theological apostate, although he was called the theological advisor to Nelson Mandela. But Carl Niehaus is a Dutch Reformed Church theological student who got kicked out of college for living with his girlfriend, being an open immorality, and I presume for heretical and other views too. You've got to be pretty bad to be kicked out of these average theological seminaries, sorry to say. There's not much standard there. And he's been bitter against the church ever since. So he became an ANC member. He's often walking around in camouflage uniform like he is some kind of uncontroversial terrorist. But at any rate, so this character, when I mentioned about the moving to Midrand, I said, so whatever happened to all of your promises of housing for all? It's going to cost billions of rand to move Parliament and to build adequate facilities, and just the National Archives alone requires, and I had the numbers at that stage, how many tens of thousands of square meters floor space it needs and so on. And Carl Niehaus said, we can sell Parliament to be a hotel or something like that. Yeah. But my response was, no, you can't. Parliament was sold, the whole land on which most of Parliament is based was sold to the Cape government for £1 by the Freemasons, on the condition that if Parliament ever moved from that spot, the property would revert back to the Freemasons for the same amount of money, i.e. £1. And Carl Niehaus's eyes were wide and his mouth dropped and he was shocked. Nelson Mandela didn't bat an eyelid. I mean, he obviously knew. Well, it's facts like that of course, undermined the whole idea of wanting to move Parliament, because the country's invested billions into developing Parliament, and we couldn't get any return on investment if we ever moved the Parliament. And that's a Freemasonry fact. And inside the grounds of Parliament, there's only one house of worship. There's a Freemason place of worship. It's in the grounds of Parliament. Now, you'd almost miss it, but if you go through the main gates from Roland Street, where there's the big statue of the first Prime Minister of South Africa, General Louis Botha, you've got directly in front of you, you have the Tuinhuis, the old governor's residence, which is now the president's office. To the right, you've got the main House of Assembly and Parliament and National Council of Provinces, which is gutted right now. But far left, immediately far left, is you've got to look for it to notice it's there, but there's the Freemason place of worship. It's on the grounds within the security perimeter, and there's many parliamentarians who go there. And of course, that included people like Thabo Mbeki. I do not know for sure, but I am pretty convinced that the present Cyril Ramaphosa must be Freemason too. I don't think he would even be in that position.
Fascinating. Yeah, Doctor, it's always so interesting to chat to you. I see our time is running out, so I want to give you one last opportunity to add, plug, or say anything that you want to.
Yes, if people would like to see pictures of these, I've written some articles and posted it on our website of both of meetings with President Mandela and the protest actions that led to it, pretty impressive, and of course the burning of Parliament and so on. So if you visit, I've got a frontlinemissionsa.org website, so frontlinemissionsa.org website, and if anyone wants any further documentation from me, peter@frontline.org.za. So I'm just finishing off a book which includes a chapter on meeting President Mandela and my debates and arguments and protests with Desmond Tutu and a whole lot of other things in our work over the last 40 years. So that, by God's grace, is going to printer next week and should be available in April in time for our 40th anniversary of cross-border missions. So Frontline's been for 40 years going behind enemy lines, and well, now we're living behind enemy lines, it seems. And I'm looking forward to that whole story getting out.
Well, thank you, Doctor. Thank you so much for your time. Obvious, if you want the details the doctor provided or spoke about, you can find the links in the description below. Please consider liking this video, sharing this as widely as possible, and subscribing to our channel. My name is Donald, and you've been watching WorldView.